What happened to prisoners in the Middle Ages? When people imagine medieval prisons, they often picture dark stone dungeons filled with chained prisoners, echoing screams, and ruthless jailers. While this image isn't entirely wrong, the reality of imprisonment in the Middle Ages was more complex and often far worse than popular portrayals suggest. Medieval prisons were not designed for rehabilitation or long-term incarceration. Instead, they were instruments of control, punishment, and coercion in a brutal legal system where survival was never guaranteed. For many prisoners, jail was not the sentence itself, but a grim holding space before something far more severe: execution, mutilation, ransom, or exile. What happened to prisoners depended heavily on their social status, the crime they were accused of, and the political context of the time. Prisons were not meant for long-term sentences. Unlike modern justice systems, medieval Europe rarely used imprisonment as a final punishment. Maintaining prisoners was expensive, and governments lacked the resources and infrastructure for long-term incarceration. As a result, prisons functioned mainly as temporary holding facilities. Most prisoners were confined while awaiting trial, punishment, payment of a fine, or ransom. Once a verdict was reached, the outcome was usually swift: execution, corporal punishment, banishment, or release. Long-term sentences were rare and typically reserved for debtors, political prisoners, or high-status captives whose lives were considered economically or politically valuable. Who ended up in prison? People could be imprisoned for a wide range of offenses, including theft, assault, debt, heresy, treason, failure to pay taxes, or violating local customs and laws. Importantly, many medieval prisoners were not convicted criminals in the modern sense. Prisons often held individuals awaiting trial, people accused on rumor or suspicion, or those caught in legal disputes that could take months or even years to resolve. In a system with limited evidence standards and inconsistent legal procedures, accusation alone was often enough to land someone behind bars. Debtors made up a significant portion of prison populations. Lending was common among merchants and landowners, but failure to repay, even small sums, could result in imprisonment. Once jailed, debtors were rarely able to earn money, making repayment nearly impossible. This created a cruel and self-perpetuating cycle. People were imprisoned because they could not pay, and they remained imprisoned precisely because incarceration stripped them of any means to do so. Entire families could be ruined as breadwinners disappeared into debtors' prisons with little hope of release. Political prisoners were especially vulnerable to abuse. Nobles, rivals, religious dissenters, or anyone perceived as a threat to authority could be imprisoned on vague, exaggerated, or entirely fabricated charges. Legal protections were weak, and rulers often used imprisonment as a tool to silence opposition or remove inconvenient figures without the public backlash of execution. In such cases, a prisoner's fate depended far less on justice or evidence, and far more on the personal will, paranoia, or political interests of those in power. Conditions inside medieval prisons. Life inside a medieval prison was harsh, unsanitary, and often deadly. Prisons were usually repurposed spaces: castle towers, gatehouses, cellars, or abandoned buildings, not structures designed for human confinement. Cells were dark, damp, and overcrowded. Ventilation was poor, and prisoners often lacked bedding, warm clothing, or protection from the cold. Straw-covered floors quickly became filthy, infested with lice, fleas, and rats. Disease spread rapidly, and outbreaks could wipe out entire prison populations. Food was minimal and of poor quality. In many places, prisoners were expected to pay for their own meals. Those without family or friends to provide food risked starvation. Clean drinking water was not guaranteed, and contaminated supplies led to illness, chains, shackles, and physical restraints. Prisoners were frequently restrained with iron chains, shackles, or collars. These were heavy, uncomfortable, and sometimes permanently attached. Long-term use caused sores, infections, and lasting injuries. High-risk or low-status prisoners might be chained to walls or floors to prevent escape. Movement was limited, and physical discomfort was constant. Torture devices were sometimes present in prisons, reinforcing fear and obedience even if they were not used regularly. Torture as a legal tool. One of the most disturbing aspects of medieval imprisonment was the use of torture. In many regions, torture was legally sanctioned as a method of extracting confessions, especially when evidence was considered insufficient. Despite the obvious fact that torture produced false confessions as often as real ones. Punishments after imprisonment. Imprisonment was often only the beginning. Once judgment was passed, punishments were swift and severe. Common penalties included execution by hanging, beheading, burning, or breaking on the wheel. Mutilation such as branding, blinding, or cutting off hands or ears. Public humiliation, including time in the stocks or pillory. Exile or banishment from towns or kingdoms. Punishments were frequently carried out in public to serve as a warning. Crowds gathered to watch, and executions became grim spectacles meant to reinforce authority and deter crime. The fate of noble prisoners. Social class made an enormous difference. Noble prisoners were treated far better than commoners. Instead of dark dungeons, they might be confined to comfortable chambers or castles. They were often allowed servants, decent food, and relative freedom of movement. Many noble prisoners were held for ransom rather than punishment. Capturing a high-status enemy during war could be financially lucrative. As long as ransom negotiations were ongoing, prisoners were usually kept alive and reasonably well treated. However, nobles were not immune to harsh outcomes. If accused of treason or seen as a serious threat, even high-born prisoners could be executed or imprisoned for life. Women and children in prison. Women were imprisoned less frequently than men, but when they were, conditions were no better. Pregnant women sometimes received temporary mercy, but this was inconsistent. Women accused of crimes like adultery, infanticide, or witchcraft faced particularly harsh treatment. Death was common behind bars. Many prisoners never made it to trial or punishment. Disease, starvation, exposure, and abuse claimed countless lives. Death in prison was often unrecorded and unremarked, especially among the poor. In some cases, imprisonment itself functioned as a death sentence. Political enemies might be quietly left to rot in remote towers, forgotten by the outside world. A system built on fear, not justice. Medieval imprisonment was not about rehabilitation or fairness. It was a tool of power designed to intimidate, extract compliance, and eliminate threats. Justice varied widely from place to place and depended heavily on wealth, connections, and status. For the vast majority of prisoners, incarceration meant suffering, uncertainty, and the constant possibility of death. Freedom was fragile, and once lost, rarely restored without lasting damage. If you're interested in uncovering more uncomfortable truths about history, from medieval punishments to everyday life in the past, keep exploring. The stories hidden behind stone walls and iron bars remind us just how far justice and humanity has evolved.